Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP European History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the age of absolutism and constitutionalism in early modern European history. During the 17th century, two distinct political developments occurred in Europe. One development was the continued increase in monarchical power with the advent of absolute monarchy. The other development was a transition toward limited government, protection of individual rights, and the creation of constitutional governments. By the end of this presentation, I want you to consider the impact that absolutism and constitutionalism had on European peoples, and in what ways did absolutism and constitutionalism in Europe contribute to Europe's growing global presence in the 17th and 18th centuries. As well, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these 6 learning objectives. 1. Explain the causes and consequences of the English Civil War. 2. Explain the continuities and changes in commercial and economic developments from 1648 to 1815. 3. Explain the factors that contributed to the development of the Dutch Republic. 4. Explain how European states attempted to establish and maintain a balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. 5. Explain how advances in technology contributed to a developing balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. And number 6, explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. As European maritime empires came of age in the latter part of the 17th and first part of the 18th centuries in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, many American, African, and Asian peoples came under greater European political and economic control. However, Europe's political leaders did not just revel in their control of maritime empires, but the increased levels of political centrality of European states played out in European populations as well. Much like in American, African, and Asian societies where Europeans gained political and economic upper hands, European populations came under unprecedented political control. Religious division from the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the emergence of 15th and 16th century new monarchs, the development of the divine right of state, and the emergence of 17th and 18th century absolute monarchs subjected ethnic and religious minorities and entire social classes of people to a level of political centrality unseen since the time of the Roman Empire. The age of absolutism, so called for the immense amount of political, economic, military, and religious authority national monarchs would have in the 17th and 18th centuries, reached numerous European states. Many national monarchs believed that they had divine right to rule over their subject peoples. Divine right was the notion that the monarch was chosen by God, favored by God, and need not answer to anyone because his rule was justified by God. In nations where 15th and 16th century new monarchs emerged, it was really a minor step to be taken for the national monarchs to achieve the status of absolute monarchs. Nations like England, Spain, and France had recent histories of new monarchs who had enhanced authority through increased taxation, the raising of their national armies and navies, and their abilities to administer top-down control over religion, religious issues, and religious subjects within their nations. In essence, come the 17th and 18th centuries, with a weaker noble class and a weakened Roman Catholic papacy, these same states, as well as others, would utilize the divine right to increase their authority over their subjects. Typically, the divine right was to be legitimized by a prominent religious institution that favored the absolute monarch. For example, in Spain and France, the Roman Catholic Church legitimized the divine right and absolutism of Spanish Habsburg and French Bourbon monarchs. Likewise, the Church of England legitimized the divine right and absolutism of Stuart monarchs in England in the 17th century. These religious institutions propagated to the subjects that they were to obey their sovereigns, and whether the subjects literally believed their sovereigns to truly be divinely selected or not. The fact that during the age of absolutism, most subjects of these European states did act as though they believed it helped to empower this new wave of national monarchs. During the first half of the 17th century, a conflict known as the 30 Years' War took place in Europe. What started out as a Bohemian rebellion against Habsburg rule in the Holy Roman Empire expanded to become a Europe-wide conflict that assembled military alliances, challenged Europe's balance of power, innovated the continent's artillery and weaponry, allowed for national monarchs to gain immense power, increased state exploitation of manpower and resources, and ultimately claimed the lives of literally millions of Europeans. The 30 Years' War was the setting for the rise of the European state system and the political absolutism and myriad of other political forms to come. Dating back to 1555, with the Peace of Augsburg, in the Holy Roman Empire, religious pluralism was tolerated within the German states. Augsburg officially recognized Lutheranism as a distinct sect of Christianity, and the princes of the northern German states sought to protect their Lutheran communities. By protecting their Lutheran communities, they also chipped away at the political influence of the Habsburg dynasty in Vienna, Austria. However, that did not mean that Vienna would not attempt to rise again over its northern states to rekindle Habsburg dominance. In 1618, Catholic envoys from Vienna, representing the Habsburg dynasty, traveled to Bohemia, specifically the city of Prague in the modern-day Czech Republic. Since the time of the Peace of Augsburg, Calvinist communities had begun to spring up in the northern states of the Holy Roman Empire, including Bohemia. Calvinists were not protected by Augsburg and experienced discrimination and persecution from the Catholic Habsburg, and had plotted to revolt against the dynasty. The envoys were greeted by Calvinist nobles and brought to the Tower of Prague Castle. As discussions regarding relations between the Bohemians and Austria intensified, the Calvinist nobles decided to send a statement to Austria. They seized the diplomats and defenestrated them. That is to say, they threw them out of the Tower of Prague Castle. Curiously, the Viennese diplomats survived the defenestration. As it goes, the Catholics say that angels appeared and saved them from their death fall. However, the Protestant view of the defenestration is that a manure cart in the yard of the Prague Castle broke the diplomats' fall. Regardless of the reasoning behind their survival, the defenestration was followed up by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II's raising of his army and invading the northern states of the Holy Roman Empire, including Bohemia. With the Bohemian phase of the war in place, the Danish, a Protestant state led by their Lutheran king Christian IV, sought to beat back the Habsburgs in the northern German states. Coming to the aid of their Protestant brothers in Bohemia, the Danish would have to deal with an increased Austrian military presence. Led by Ferdinand's most able commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein, Denmark's military would be forced into surrender. Ferdinand would pass his Edict of Restitution in 1629 and began his attempts at retaking former Catholic lands from Calvinists and Lutherans, and pressed to re-Catholicize the Protestants with aggressive legions of Jesuit missionaries. The conclusion of the Danish phase showed a growing power in Austria that struck the nerve of other nearby European states. This time, the Swedes would get themselves involved to counteract the military success of Austria. Seeking their own territorial expansion, the Swedish, under their monarch and military genius, Gustavus Adolphus, invaded northern Europe against the Habsburg dynasty and its forces. Albrecht von Wallenstein would be assassinated in the conflict, as Sweden enjoyed early success. Adolphus pushed south toward Austria, but was not powerful enough to defeat the Habsburg dynasty outright. Sweden abandoned their campaign and compromised with the Habsburg dynasty, and the Habsburgs rescinded the Edict of Restitution. France, who had sat idle during the early phases of the 30 Years' War, showed itself to be a state that sought opportunity to expand their political and territorial influence, even if it meant breaking previous military and/or religious alliances. Louis XIII, a Bourbon monarch and devout Roman Catholic, decided that his personal faith and France's history of Catholicism did not suffice his decision to join in the 30 Years' War. Rather than join his Catholic brothers of Austria and Spain and do battle against heathen Protestants of Northern Europe, Louis XIII threw his military support toward the Swedes and other Protestants. Seeing the growth of Habsburg power was more dangerous to the Bourbons than the growth of Protestantism. The French phase of the conflict overwhelmed the Holy Roman Empire, and they soon pushed for peace. France had demonstrated its political and military superiority on the continent and forced Europe's transition from religious matters dictating military action to political and economic matters dictating military action. The final peace agreements were made in the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. The Peace of Westphalia created an even greater political divisiveness within the Holy Roman Empire. Furthermore, the Habsburgs' days were numbered with regards to controlling the political and religious lives of people of the northern states of the Holy Roman Empire. Both Lutheran and Calvinist communities were now protected, and the princes of those German states personally chose their state's official religion. This allowed for other political elites to emerge within the German states, including the Hohenzollern dynasty into Prussia. The seeds of political absolutism had been planted within the states of the Holy Roman Empire and throughout the rest of Europe. Greater political centrality would be practiced in every European state. Secular political elites now wielded far more authority than any religious elite, and in fact, the Peace of Westphalia failed to involve or even consider the papacy's position on the territories and decisions made in 1648. One location where greater political centrality was exhibited was in the Stuart monarchy in post-Elizabethan England. James and Charles Stuart, the first two monarchs of the 17th century in England, believed they had divine right to rule over England with an absolutist iron fist. As the newest supreme governors of the Church of England, they viewed any Catholics or Anglicans who opposed their rule and opposed virtually all Puritans and saw them as their religious and political enemies. Of course, James and Charles would act on those views and created an England in which Puritans, separatists, and disloyal Anglicans would head for greener pastures in places more accepting of their reformed ways. In some cases, this religious and political persecution took them to the Dutch Netherlands, who had recently gained their independence from Catholic Spain earlier in the late 16th century. In other cases, this religious and political persecution took them to the newly developing North American colonies. However, not all non-Catholics were removed from England, as some of them held titles of nobility and seats in Parliament, England's body politic that traditionally enacted laws and loyally served the English crown. By the time of Charles I's reign, Parliament was a misused and abused body politic, typically used merely for the raising of taxes so Charles could enact militant violence on other political and religious enemies in and out of England. In 1628, to urge Charles to end martial law and to respect Englishmen' property and judicial rights, parliamentary leaders issued the Petition of Right. This challenge led to Charles's dissolution of Parliament in 1629, so as to keep it out of his way of his own political and military agenda. 11 years later, in 1640, Charles allowed Parliament to reconvene for only a 3-week period. This became known as the Short Parliament for its brevity. He dismissed the body politic again and called for its reconvening one more time at the end of 1640, the so-called Long Parliament. Eventually, members of the Long Parliament called for reforms in the king's treatment of Parliament, such as the 19 Propositions of 1642, which sought to restrict Charles I's authority and share political authority with the Parliament. However, the 19 Propositions were interpreted as a parliamentary challenge to Charles's absolute rule, and the English Civil War broke out. Under the direction of Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, soldier, and former member of Parliament, a pro-parliamentary army, known as the Roundheads, convened and challenged the Cavalier army of King Charles I. Over the course of the 1640s, the Roundheads would defeat the Cavaliers, and King Charles I would be beheaded, and England would exist for an entire decade without a monarch. From 1649 until 1660, England functioned without a monarch and was referred to as the Commonwealth. In fact, for half of that time, the nation's leader was Oliver Cromwell, as he served as Lord Protectorate of the English Commonwealth. His death in 1658 ended the Commonwealth period, and in 1660, Parliament decided to restore the English monarchy, known as the Restoration. They allowed for Charles II, the son of the late and beheaded Charles I, to ascend to the throne. Yes, a Stuart monarch would once again rule over England. However, Charles II played well with Parliament, as he accepted many of the terms of the Petition of Right and the 19 Propositions. He treated Parliament with respect and helped to bring stability to England. However, Charles II's death in 1685 brought his brother James II to the throne. James II's open proclamation of his Roman Catholic faith did not sit well with the English Parliament, nor any of England's Protestant allies. Even within the Stuart family, religious issues were present. Mary, the daughter of James II, was an Anglican and had married the Protestant Dutch statesman William of Orange. The Netherlands had been a republic since its independence from Spain a century before. In the Dutch Republic, an oligarchy of urban gentry and rural landholders helped to promote trade and protect traditional rights. In that time, the Dutch Republic was an example of an early modern state that had broken from the path of new monarchy and absolute monarchy. In 1688, the English Parliament's alliance with William of Orange brought a Dutch military presence into England. At this point, King James II would either have to fight or flee from England. Rather than repeat the history of the English Civil War and potentially have a repeat of what happened to his father happen to him, James fled England. This bloodless overthrow became known as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary would rule as Protestant monarchs and reign with a powerful pro-Protestant parliament. In 1689, the same year as William and Mary ascended to the throne as co-monarchs, England's parliament secured the English Bill of Rights, the landmark document that protected Englishmen' rights to property, life, and liberty. These bouts between Parliament and absolute monarchs led to victories for this representative body, and allowed for the triumph of constitutionalism over absolutism in England. Though increased monarchical authority would go challenged by existent political, social, and economic elites in France, the outcome did not go exactly the same way as it had in England. In 17th century France, an entire class of French nobles and political elites bared witness to the ever-increasing political centrality of the Bourbon dynasty in France. France, having just exited the 30 Years' War, the most destructive war in European history prior to World War I, and having been on the winning side of the 30 Years' War, existed in a vulnerable state of financial failure. King Louis XIII had passed away in 1643, with 5 years remaining in the 30 Years' War. Louis's wife, Anne of Austria, would serve as regent of France, while her son, eventually Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a child. Her primary advisor was Cardinal Mazarin, who sought to raise taxes on the French aristocracy and noble elites in order to pay off debt from the 30 Years' War. At first, these new taxes spawned a revolt by members of the French judiciary, known as the First Fronde. However, Anne and Mazarin easily put down the First Fronde. A few years later, led by the disgruntled Louis II of Bourbon, Prince of Condé, a second Fronde ignited. A French war hero in his battles against Spain during the 30 Years' War, Louis had become disillusioned with the relative lack of respect and consideration the French monarchy had for the French aristocracy. The Second Fronde, which was much more fierce and contested, raged until 1653. By that time, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was 1 year from his coronation, and Anne and Mazarin sought to leave an immense amount of central authority to Louis. Anne and Mazarin successfully put down the Second Fronde, and in its wake, Louis XIV endeavored a monarchy of divine right and absolute power unprecedented in French lands. Louis would revoke the Edict of Nantes, and an aggressive Roman Catholic sovereign would once again govern France. Additionally, Louis and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the genius behind French mercantilism within France and in France's overseas dominion, extended administrative, financial, and military control of the central state over France's population. Rather than nobles or new economic elites having agency in France's government, Louis, his administration, and his bureaucracy of intendants secured absolute power. Over his 72-year reign, Louis worked to weaken the nobility by occupying them in his palace at Versailles, leaving matters of politics, military, and economics to him and his band of advisors. In essence, Louis was able to limit the nobility's participation in governance, yet preserve its social position and legal privileges. During the period of French Baroque art and architecture, the Palace of Versailles would be adorned with numerous marble terraces and plazas, fountains and royal apartments, and more than 700 rooms. The most elaborate of the features was the Hall of Mirrors, adorned with more than 300 mirrors on the walls and in the archways of the hall. This lavish palace became the central command of Louis XIV's absolutism, and it would remain as such until the French Revolution in 1789, an entire century longer than absolutism had lived in England. Louis was notorious for utilizing his military continuously throughout his long reign. Like his father, King Louis XIII, Louis XIV was not scared to utilize his military to secure his political, territorial, and economic agendas. In most of his military endeavors, Louis ended up costing the French nation an exorbitant amount of money, resources, and diplomatic trust. During the 1670s, Louis attacked the Dutch Republic in the so-called Dutch War, as he deemed the Dutch Republic to be a trade rival, a Protestant rival, and a political rival. As other European states involved themselves in the conflict, Louis would eventually make peace with the Dutch and the other belligerents. Louis was untrustworthy to many of the political leaders of his time, including William of Orange, the reigning king of England at the end of the 1680s. The Grand Alliance of England, the Netherlands, and Austria, in spite of Austria's Roman Catholic tradition, formed to combat Louis's military aggression. Louis and the Grand Alliance conflicted once again during the 9 Years' War between 1688 and 1697, yet another costly war in which Louis attempted to assert his dominance over Northern Europe. Stability and the European balance of power would be in the hands of the Sun King. Finally, Louis took his last shot at expanding France's power against his European rivals, but this time he looked south to Spain. Spain's last Habsburg king, Charles II, died with no heir. Louis saw this as an opportunity to unify France and Spain under the Bourbon dynasty. In another costly war that shook Europe's balance of power, the War of the Spanish Succession occurred. In the end, Louis XIV's grandson would succeed to Spain's throne and rule as Philip V. However, the balance of power would be retained, as France and Spain were not allowed to unify per the Treaty of Utrecht of 1714. Ultimately, France was an indebted nation that experienced the hardship of an absolute monarch, and the impact of that debt and military aggression would live on much longer than the Sun King, who died the following year in 1715. Russia would also become a state that experienced political absolutism. With the rise of the Romanov dynasty in the early 17th century, Russian political centrality gained more and more authority. However, it was not until the reign of Peter the Great, between 1682 and 1725, where Russia's absolutism really took form. Peter altered the Russian Orthodox Church and created the Holy Synod, which meant that the church now fell under his state administration. Traditionally, the Patriarch from Moscow had supreme religious authority over all Orthodox Christians within Russia. However, Peter did not tolerate any single individual having more authority than him, even if it meant religious authority. Additionally, Peter was a fanatic of Western European culture and worked hard to transition Russia from an Asian nation to a European nation. Peter the Great westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions in the early 18th century. His reforms included forcing Russian urbanites to groom and fashion themselves according to French and other European practices. He assessed fines on urban men who did not shave their beards. He also sponsored the Russian Academy of Sciences, Western-style schools, and expanded his military. Although Russian interests to the east beyond the Ural Mountains in Siberia and even in Alaska in North America were important to Peter, his large-standing army and professional navy worked hard against northern European states, like the mighty state of Sweden in the Great Northern War, in hopes of securing territory and access to warm water ports. Even prior to Russia's age of absolutism, imperial palaces had helped to display the wealth, power, and prestige of the political elites. In Moscow, the Kremlin, which was reconstructed in the 15th century during the reign of Muscovite Prince Ivan the Great, served as the imperial palace of the Russian Empire until the middle of the 18th century. Another Russian imperial palace that furthered political centrality and demonstrated wealth, power, and prestige of the political elites was the Winter Palace. Built in the early 18th century and begun in the late reign of Peter the Great, the Winter Palace was designed as a lavish, Baroque imperial palace in a newly constructed Western-influenced city known as St. Petersburg near the Baltic Sea in Western Russia. As Peter's window to the west, St. Petersburg's Winter Palace became the headquarters for the Romanov dynasty until its overthrow in 1917. Although the age of absolutism mostly witnessed a lack of civility, privilege, and protection for most Europeans. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe did continue to increase its productive capacity and its influence abroad. In Europe, a second agricultural revolution was underway, as lands were enclosed, commercialized, and more productive than ever before. New agricultural techniques, such as new methods of crop rotation and the use of nitrogen replenishing crops like the turnip, enabled greater productivity. The continued arrival of staple crops from the Americas had lasting demographic impact on Europeans. As nutrition improved, famine reduced. As well, diseases associated with malnutrition, especially childhood diseases, reduced, and Europe's population began to age as it grew. In terms of manufacturing, 18th century Europe experienced a sort of proto-industrialization. In textile production, the putting out system, sometimes referred to as the cottage industry, expanded and allowed for an increase in the production of woolen and cotton textiles. Entrepreneurs took resources like wool and cotton to the peasant homes. In those peasant homes, the families would spin and produce woolen and cotton textiles. Eventually, the entrepreneurs would return to claim their products and sell the textiles in local and long-distance markets. Outside of the continent, European states increased their dominance over the worldwide economic network. The commercial revolution was fueled by increased production and commercial activity. The Atlantic slave trade would reach its height in the last half of the 18th century, which enabled greater production in the colonies and greater consumption on the continent. Europeans came to enjoy sugar, tea, coffee, rum, tobacco, silk, and cotton, as their absolutist leaders commanded the exploitation of the world's labor and resources. Granted, the age of absolutism may have been mostly characterized by the exploitation of European subjects to their absolute monarchs, their liberties, privileges, and rights suspended, and in many cases, never even in existence. The plight of the underrepresented in Europe lived under the thumb of their oppressive masters. In only a couple of instances did the reach of absolutism get cut short, in the experiences of the Dutch Republic and England's parliamentary sovereignty. However, as much as Europe may have suffered a political, religious, and social plight due to the exploitations of the age of absolutism, it is worth noting that Europe's world status continued to climb at the same time.